Every year on his late daughter's birthday, a grieving father called her number, knowing no one would ever pick up. But this time someone answered. What followed was a chain of events that unearthed a buried truth about love, memory, and the connection that refused to die. Stay tuned for a story that will make you question what really ends when a life is lost, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Every April 11th, on his daughter's birthday, David Hayes performed the same ritual. He'd walk into his daughter's old bedroom, untouched for 3 years since her tragic death. David would sit there, the silence loud around him, and pull out his phone. He scrolled to her name, Lena, saved just like that, unchanged. He would dial her number, not to hear a voice. There hadn't been one since the funeral. The number had long been disconnected, but calling it, that was never about reason. It was grief, guilt, the echo of hope, even when hope no longer made sense. This time, however, something changed. The phone didn't go straight to an error message. It rang. David's heart thudded against his ribs. He stared at the screen. Still said Lena. Still the same number. He pressed the phone closer to his ear. Then, hello? A girl's voice. Young, real, not a voicemail. David's breath caught. Lena? He whispered. There was a pause, thick with something unspoken. Then, shakily, Dad? And just like that, the line went dead. David blinked. The phone screen now read, "This number is no longer in service," the way it always had, but the voice had been real. And it wasn't from memory. 3 years earlier, David and Lena had their last conversation, and it hadn't ended with "I love you." She had come to him that morning with her mind made up. She wanted to defer college. 1 year. Just time to think, maybe travel, maybe figure herself out before plunging into 4 years of something she didn't believe in. David, proud and practical, couldn't see it that way. You want to waste your future backpacking through nowhere? That's not freedom, that's fear, he'd snapped. Their voices had risen, frustration colliding with worry. Lena had always been bright, her notebooks filled with sketches, ideas, things she wanted to build, things she wanted to change. David saw her as a comet, brilliant, fast, unstoppable. The idea of her veering off track terrified him. She stormed out that evening. "I need space," she'd said, standing in the hallway in that same sunflower hoodie. Her eyes were glassy, but her jaw was set. "I'll be fine. I just need to breathe." He hadn't followed her. Hours later, a semi-truck lost control on Route 7. Witnesses said the compact car it hit had barely cleared the curve when the impact happened. The passenger side took the brunt. The car spun into a tree. Then, fire. By the time first responders arrived, it was too late. They recovered one body, female, burned beyond recognition. Inside the charred remains, they found Lena's purse wedged under the seat. Her phone, blackened but still intact enough to power on. A half-melted student ID. The car was registered in her name. The coroner told David the truth in the coldest terms. The damage was extensive. There was no point in seeing her. No need to subject himself to that kind of pain. It was her. Everything matched. David had nodded numbly. He signed the forms. They buried her in a closed casket the following week. No one suggested a DNA test. No autopsy was ordered. There had been no reason to question it. The grief was too thick. The evidence, her belongings, the car, was too persuasive. But David never deleted her contact, never touched her room, and every April 11th, without fail, he dialed her number. Until the day someone answered. David couldn't shake the voice he heard on the phone. It hadn't been imagined, not a memory, not grief playing cruel tricks. He had heard her, the tremble in her voice, the pause, the way she said "Dad" like a child waking from a nightmare. He tried the number again. Each time the recording returned. "This number is no longer in service." Still unsettled, David contacted the phone carrier. He explained the situation, though he left out the part about his daughter being declared dead. The agent pulled up the record. "Yes, sir. This number was deactivated almost 3 years ago. The SIM was removed from the system. It shouldn't be capable of receiving or making calls." David hung up and stared at the wall, his thoughts unraveling. Something didn't fit. That night, he climbed into the attic and pulled out the old box marked Crash Records. He hadn't touched it in nearly 3 years, not since the funeral. Inside were police reports, coroner summaries, towing documentation. He read it all again, slowly this time. There was no DNA test, no autopsy, no visual confirmation, just a single sentence repeated in different forms. One female body recovered from the driver's seat. No additional victims found. One body. He read the next line again, identified via recovered purse, phone, and student ID. Body unrecognizable. That was it. That was all it took to bury her. David's hands trembled. He remembered asking, "Are you sure?" He remembered the coroner's polite professional nod. "Yes, sir. The evidence is conclusive." But it hadn't been. Not really. Something else gnawed at him now. The report said she was found in the driver's seat, but Lena had always hated driving at night. She avoided highways. She preferred the passenger's side, sketching or napping. And more than that, if she had picked someone up, as she'd often done when she saw girls walking alone, would she have let them drive? That thought caught in his throat like a splinter. It was no longer grief pulling David forward. It was something colder, sharper. An instinct he had ignored for too long. That voice on the phone hadn't come from nowhere, and the crash report had gaps that now felt deliberate, almost surgically avoided. He didn't want another memorial or a theory. He wanted proof. So he went looking for it, not in memories, but in paper. He filed an open records request with the county and demanded every emergency call logged the night of April 11th within a 10-mile radius of mile marker 19. He wasn't just after the accident file. He wanted everything: the roadside breakdowns, the wildlife collisions, the ambulance runs that were dismissed as noise, anything that hadn't been glued to Lena's case, anything that might have slipped through the cracks because someone thought it didn't belong. When the envelope arrived days later, he opened it with trembling hands. Inside was a thick stack of reports, most filled with static, but halfway through, clipped under an unrelated incident number, was a 2-paragraph entry that made his skin prickle. 11:24 p.m. Unidentified female found crawling from embankment 300 yards east of Route 7. Partial burns visible on arms and face. No ID on person. Disoriented. Possible head trauma. No nearby vehicle located. Transported via airlift to St. Mercy ICU. Registered as Jane Doe. David reread the line 3 times, barely blinking. The time matched. The geography matched. The injuries, burns, and confusion were consistent with proximity to an explosion, not a direct impact. There had been no mention of seatbelt bruising, no lacerations from glass, and most glaringly, no second crash was recorded that night in that area. No overturned vehicle, no second scene. The girl had appeared out of the dark, dragging herself toward the road, with no name, no story, and no one looking for her. Because the only person who should have matched her description was already declared dead. No one would have thought to look for another victim, because the authorities had never questioned the story they'd built for themselves. David set the report down slowly, his throat tight. It wasn't confirmation. Not yet. But it was more than suspicion. It was the first threat of something terrifying. The woman was listed in the trauma records as Eva Marsh, a placeholder name assigned 3 years ago when she was brought in without identification, unconscious, and badly burned. David had called every number in the chain of custody until he was transferred to a voice that paused when he explained what he was looking for. Dr. Maya Cole didn't offer false hope, but she didn't hang up either. She simply said, "I think you should come." The care facility sat tucked along the edges of an old rural town in Indiana, quiet and sunlit, surrounded by whispering trees. As David followed Dr. Cole through its long halls, he could feel the weight in his chest press harder with every step. She explained the clinical details, Eva's memory gaps, her dissociation, the failed attempts at identity tracing. But David barely heard her. He was chasing something far less tangible than charts or scans. "She often repeats certain fragments," Maya said gently as they reached the courtyard doors. "Not full memories, just pieces, words, associations. Some are sensory, fresh oil, the sound of wind chimes, the smell of burnt leather. But there are 3 things that surface more than anything else." She stopped walking. "One is Dad, sometimes with fear, sometimes with longing. Another is sunflowers, she draws them constantly. And the last is the other girl, always in a whisper, always with a tremble." David's throat tightened. He said nothing. Through the glass he could already see her, sitting cross-legged by a bed of wildflowers, alone, quiet, a sketchbook balanced on her knees. She wore a gray hoodie with yellow sleeves, too large for her frame, its cuffs loose around her wrists. The sleeves were pushed up just enough to reveal pale scars, faded but unmistakable, stretching across her forearms like delicate brushstrokes left by fire. He stepped outside slowly, as if afraid the sound of gravel might startle her into vanishing. She didn't look up. She was drawing again. He moved closer. The paper was filled with flowers, not a bouquet, but a horizon of them. Tall, vivid, leaning east like they were reaching for the morning sun. They were unmistakable. Sunflowers. David's knees went weak. Lena had loved them. She used to tuck one behind her ear when she worked in the garage with him, had painted an entire wall in the shed with gold and green. He stood still, afraid to breathe. Then, voice low and trembling, he spoke. "Lena?" She froze. The pencil paused mid-stroke. Her back stiffened, and for a second she didn't turn. But then, slowly, she looked over her shoulder. Her eyes met his. There was confusion first, then something deeper, flickering like light beneath ice. Her lips parted, and a small breath escaped. "Dad?" David stepped closer, his heart roaring in his ears. She didn't move away. She stared at him, wide-eyed, as if recognizing something not with her memory, but her marrow. Then, in a voice no louder than a prayer, she whispered, "The other girl." She asked to switch seats. David stopped. His chest collapsed inward. He could barely hold himself upright. Dr. Cole remained just behind him, silent, her face unreadable but her eyes watching everything. Eva looked back at the sketchbook in her lap. Her hand moved again, softer now, sketching petals. Her voice came almost like an echo. "Sunflowers. Dad. The girl." She was afraid. David knelt slowly beside her, not touching, not speaking, just listening. And in that moment, he knew. This wasn't a fantasy. This wasn't hope running wild. This was real. His daughter hadn't died. She had survived, forgotten, misnamed, lost. But now, she was beginning to remember. Dr. Maya Cole didn't offer theories or reassurance. She simply handed David a folder. Inside were the intake records for the young woman they'd called Eva Marsh. For 3 years, the pages had lived in storage, reviewed, updated, archived. But no one had ever connected them to an unsolved mystery, because officially, there hadn't been one. The notes were clinical, precise, no identification recovered. No personal belongings. Burn injuries on one side of the body, pattern consistent with flash exposure, not. Prolonged burning, lacerations on the hands and arms, likely sustained while crawling through underbrush. No seatbelt bruising. No. Internal injuries typical of a high-speed impact. She hadn't been in the car. David didn't speak. He read each detail slowly until the shape of what had happened began to form. Not in memory, but in logic. Lena had stepped out. That much was clear. She must have pulled over to help the girl. The same frightened hitchhiker David now understood had existed. Something had scared the girl badly enough to ask to switch seats. Lena, trying to calm her down, had obliged. And in those few minutes, seconds even, the truck appeared. The girl in the driver's seat never had a chance. Her body was destroyed, her face unrecognizable. But Lena's purse and ID were on the floorboard, just inches from her. No one had questioned it. Not the coroner, not the police, not even David. He had been too crushed by grief to ask for proof. She was listed as Jane Doe, Dr. Cole said quietly, and she stayed that way. There was no attempt to link her to the crash, because the crash had already been ruled closed. David clenched the folder. His fingers trembled against the edges. The certainty was there now, not as hope, not as suspicion, but as truth. He had buried the wrong girl, and his daughter had been trying in some broken way to come home ever since. There was still one question David couldn't answer, the one that had started all of this. How did the call go through? The number had been dead for years. The carrier confirmed it had been deactivated shortly after Lena's presumed death. No SIM card tied to it had been active since. Yet, a week ago, on her birthday, at the exact moment he always called, someone had picked up. Lena. She had said his name. He brought it up with Dr. Cole on his next visit. She hesitated, then led him through a side hallway of the care center, down into a small therapy lab where patients sometimes engaged with old tech for memory stimulation, radios, cassette players, disposable cameras. At the back of the room, a young nurse named Sienna Tran was cataloging old phones into a locked cabinet. When Maya explained, Sienna opened a drawer and pulled out a small bag. Inside was a melted flip phone, blackened at the edges, the screen cracked, but the SIM card slot still intact. "I found it sealed in an unclaimed pouch a few weeks ago," Sienna said, holding the bag gently. It was mixed in with other recovered items from long-term patients. The label just said personal effects, unknown. I thought it might have usable parts, so I slotted the SIM into one of our rehab devices. It powered on for a second, just long enough to test audio playback. David stared at it. That SIM, Sienna continued, must have been re-registered for a moment during the sync. Sometimes during carrier maintenance, orphaned SIMs reconnect briefly, just enough to appear on the network. It happens in rare back-end refreshes, usually only for seconds. David felt something unsteady move through his chest. I called during that window, he said quietly. Sienna nodded. The line connected for less than a minute. I didn't even realize it had rung. She must have had the device in her lap. Dr. Cole added, she'd been restless all morning, pacing, sketching, refusing breakfast. When I checked on her after lunch, she kept asking if anyone had said her name. David turned the pouch over in his hands. The SIM card, melted around the edges, had survived the fire. And in that microscopic moment of reactivation, it had done something it hadn't done in 3 years. It had reached across time, across doubt, across everything that had gone wrong. And Lena had answered. Lena didn't remember everything, but when David brought her home, she stood for a long time at the threshold of her bedroom, where her old hoodie still hung from the chair and the sunflower tapestry above the bed hadn't moved in 3 years. She stepped in slowly, then turned and buried herself in her father's arms. No words, just breath, and a silence that finally felt full. There were no headlines, no cameras, just a father who never stopped calling, and a daughter who somehow answered. But what happened still lingers like a question whispered through time. The phone from the crash, melted, ruined, forgotten, was sealed in a pouch and accidentally transferred with medical debris to the same trauma care facility where Lena, burned and unnamed, had been sent. For years, both lay in silence under the same roof, without anyone knowing they belonged to each other. Then, on Lena's birthday, a nurse pulled the SIM card from that scorched phone and inserted it into a rehab device, just to test old audio files. At that exact moment, David called. And somehow, against logic, time, and reason, his daughter picked up. What are the chances that a destroyed phone and a missing girl would both survive, both end up in the same place, both wait for years, and then align for just 60 seconds? Was it a coincidence, or was it something only God could have orchestrated? What do you believe? Let us know in the comments. Because sometimes, what seems like chance is actually mercy, and what we call coincidence, God might call right on time. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next story.